Personally, I'm very interested in politics. As part of that, I like to further my understanding of different ideologies as much as I can, whether I agree with them or not, and this is a view that I wish more people shared. Unfortunately, people are usually far too dug in when it comes to their own political leanings that they want to spend more time trying to one-up the opposition than actually trying to understand their viewpoint. This is no more evident than in the argument over the place of National Socialism, or Nazism, on the political spectrum. It's essentially become a no-man's land for political argumentum ad hominem between the left and the right. The video which I will be replying to today is a good demonstration of this. My hope with this response is that it will help at least some people truly understand what National Socialism is and where it fits on the political spectrum.
The argument is basically that Hitler was a far-right radical, and therefore when we proceed to label someone as far-right, we think, oh wait, Hitler was far-right, therefore far-right equals bad. Here's the kicker. Hitler and the Nazis were leftists, and everyone that thinks otherwise has a far greater understanding of Occupy Democrats memes than they do Nazism.
I reject the notion that any side of the political spectrum is inherently evil. Actions by governments which follow a particular ideology can be evil, but when it comes to the ideology itself, it depends on implementation. Evil caused by governments isn't so much an ideological issue as it is a policy issue, the difference being ideology is broad and policy is specific. Two people could have the same ideology with different ideas of how to implement it and somewhat different policies they may want to enact. Then we come to the introduction of the idea that Nazis are left-leaning. This part and others throughout the video mark what seems to be a complete disregard of centrist political thought, substituting it for more of a black and white view on the political spectrum. I should state that my politics, like many others, don't fall squarely into liberal or conservative. I'm not even quite sure what ideology I fit into most, but my best guess would be somewhere between nationalism, right populism, and national conservatism. The point is, my disagreement with the claim presented by this video comes not from a personal ideological standpoint, but from an objective, factual understanding of what National Socialism is as a system of beliefs.
Argument in particular, one of the issues that we have is we often make weak arguments. We cut corners intellectually. We'll say stuff like, well, if they weren't socialists, why did they call themselves National Socialists? Checkmate, liberal. But it's like, then the typical response would be, are you familiar with the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea? So
this is an argument presented all too often by conservative pundits to counter the claim that Nazism is far right. But not only is it a very poor argument, as John explains, it also shows a lot of ignorance as to one's concept of Nazism. The main issue with it is that Nazism uses a different kind of socialism. If you know anything about Nazis and fascists, you'll know they despised Marxism, which is leftist socialism's entire foundation. National Socialism is a form of socialism which does not depend on the seizure of the means of production by the workers, the redistribution of wealth, the abolishment of private property, or the destruction of classes. These things are essential to some extent in all forms of Marxism, and were rejected by Nazism. That in itself could derail the whole argument, but there's more, so let's continue.
Itself isn't a strong enough argument. The best argument can be derived from the historical evidence that we have that describes exactly what Nazism was. So first let's talk about why people think that Hitler and the Nazis were far right. So in the early 20th century, as socialism became more popular, Nazism is said to have been a reactionary movement of people that were against the doctrines of socialism and in favor of capitalism and of free markets. They cite that the Nazi Party received support from many industrialists in the early 1930s, therefore, it must be a free market system of beliefs. This ignores the fact that the Nazis were openly waging a cultural war on the communists that the industrialists also hated, because if the communists gained legitimate traction, the industrialists would be tremendously hurt by this.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend type of thing. So they also note that the Nazi Party's economic policies in practice were different than Russian socialism, since the means of production, entrepreneurship, and market exchange were under private ownership. The problem is, this is only a superficial system of private ownerships, because through their system of economic intervention and control, the entrepreneurial function of the property owners was, it was completely controlled by the state. As a result, shop owners, they didn't have to speculate about the future for the purpose of allocating resources in the pursuit of profits. Exactly like in the Soviet Union, entrepreneurial speculation, resource allocation, it's done by a single entity, which is the state.
But the difference between the economic system of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany is that one has businesses owned by the state and the other heavily regulates the businesses. Seizing the businesses is a Marxist principle as part of controlling the means of production and industry as a whole for the benefit of the community. In less authoritarian versions of Marxism, state-funded unions and generous welfare are used instead. Businesses under fascism and National Socialism are privately owned and controlled, but the government regulates them so that they at best serve the interests of the state, and at worst don't harm the interests of the state. That's not a leftist economic policy, that's a policy of totalitarian government control. It's not a free market by any stretch, but they're privately owned businesses that are actual proper business owners, unlike the Soviet Union.
The property owners were called shop managers, or the German word.
I know it's Halloween, but we should invade Poland tomorrow.
And the government tells these seeming entrepreneurs what to produce, how much of it to produce, at what prices and from whom to buy, and at what prices and to whom to sell. The government decrees at what wages laborers should work, and to whom and under what terms the capitalists should entrust their funds. Market exchange is just a sham. All prices, wages, and interest rates are fixed by the authority. They're prices, wages, and interest rates in appearance only. They're merely quantitative terms in the authoritarian orders determining each citizen's income, consumption, and standard of living. The authority, not the consumers, directs production. The Central Board of Production Management is supreme. All citizens are nothing else but civil servants. This is the socialism with the outward appearance of capitalism. Some labels of the capitalistic market economy are retained, but they signify here something entirely different from what they mean in a market economy.
You seem to be implying that wage, interest, and price regulations are a completely alien concept. Minimum wage was being championed in the United States well before the Nazis started to gain any traction in Germany, and was being implemented in other Western countries during and before the Nazis came to power. Most countries regulate interest rates through laws against usury, which National Socialism attempted to combat. Countries such as Britain use price cap regulation to keep inflation from driving prices up, like what happened in Germany after the Treaty of Versailles and the Great Depression. And once again, the seemingly black and white outlook on ideology comes into effect. They weren't trying to have the outward appearance of a market economy, they were trying to do something completely different. Fascism and Nazism are antithetical to Marxism and capitalism, which is why they consider themselves as a quote-unquote third way.
They even refer to the Nazis as state capitalists, which I really just think is a way to be sneaky while still labeling them as capitalists. And
state capitalism is actually further left than National Socialism. It's usually what happens in the aftermath of communist regimes when the government wants to become more capitalist but can't just make the jump. Businesses remain state-owned, but instead of them being solely for the supposed benefit of society, they're used for profit. The difference between it and Nazism again being the ownership of business.
the Nazis weren't trying to hide this at all, which is why it's so funny. The leftist historians maintain that the Nazis were actually right-wing, but Joseph Stalin actually helped fuel this narrative too. My boy Ioseb, how do you pronounce that? But when the Nazis invaded the USSR, Stalin tried to redefine National Socialism as capitalism, and he promoted the idea that they were in the final stages of capitalism. And National Socialism was never Marxism, but it was influenced by the same German socialists that influenced Karl Marx. But since they didn't fit into the traditional Soviet Marxist worldview, they were referred to as capitalists, despite Nazis consistently implementing socialist policies and doing so quite proudly.
Of course, Stalin would call Nazism capitalism. In the USSR, everything that wasn't communism was capitalism. It's a lot easier to explain why you hate one ideology and then group all of your ideological opposition into that than it is to explain why you hate various different ideologies. That's part of the reason why this argument is happening at all. National Socialist economics weren't really inspired by any one person from before the 20th century, and were essentially just mercantilism reformed to work in a post-industrial society. Gottfried Feder, one of the original members of the National Socialist Party and political mentor of Hitler, formed what was essentially the basis of economic theory for the party. The only inspirations from the 19th century and before were race theorists such as Darwin, who gave them the basis of their racial politics, and various anti-Semitic writers which gave them their justification to demonize Jews. Their policies were, again, diametrically opposed to Marxism.
Nazis were fascists. So, what is fascism? A lot of people, when they think about the political spectrum, they think communism is the extreme left and fascism is the extreme right. And that's not true. It's so far from true. You'll see how ridiculous it is in a second when we break it down. So, fascism, by definition, is a political philosophy that exalts nation above individual, stands for a centralized autocratic government, severe economic and social regulation, and suppression of any dissent through force. Nazism added anti-Semitism and eugenics into this as well, which is what is often thought to be the key difference between Nazism and fascism. The Nazis were strongly against liberal democracy. What is liberal democracy? America, basically, in practice. Liberal democracy, which is also called Western democracy, is a representative, classically liberal government characterized by things like elections between multiple political parties, a separation of powers into different branches of government, market economies and private property rights, equal protections of people under the law, stuff like that. So you've got the Nazis. They're openly against free markets, democracy, limited government, free speech, individual rights. I'm gonna slow down.
But they're also far right, and if you look at the political spectrum that they pass around, it's actually mind-bogglingly stupid. It's like a form of miracle. So you take a look at it, you've got conservatism and liberalism, and then you've got farther left, you've got socialism and communism. Okay, that makes sense, because when you go from liberalism to socialism to communism, you're adding more and more regulation and taking more and more freedom away. So it's consistent. There's a trend. There's a trend that follows as you travel farther to the left. But When you look at the right-hand side, you go from conservatism to libertarianism, which is a substantial decrease in regulation and a substantial increase in personal liberty. And then what this chart literally says is when you increase personal freedom and decrease regulation, you end up with fascism, with a far-right ideology like fascism. How? How do you get further right adding freedom, shrinking government, and all of a sudden the state is in control of everything? You lose your free speech, you lose your free markets, you lose your branches of government, your democracy. It's all gone. The trend as you head farther right is less regulation, and then it suggests that the extent of that, so few regulations, it's actually so extreme, it would be fascism, which demonstrates a shocking lack of knowledge in either chart making or fascism.
Who's the most popular libertarian? We like Ron Paul. We've all gone through the Ron Paul phase. We've all got a copy of End the Fed. But the leftist academics are literally trying to tell you that the farther right you go, Ron Paul wants income tax abolished, Federal Reserve abolished, heroin legalized. If you get farther right than Ron Paul, you all of a sudden sacrifice every principle that this country was founded upon, every principle that the right wing in this country is trying so hard to preserve, and then you become a fascist.
The reality is that if you were to place fascism on the political spectrum where it actually belongs, it would be on the left. That's the reality. No one with even an elementary understanding of political thought would argue that adding authoritarian control over the economy is a right-wing principle. It's just absurd. So what is right-wing? What does right-wing mean? What are we saying when we describe something as right-wing? What do you mean by far right? What principles of right-wing thought are taken to the extreme under this ideology? As you go farther left, you add more government control over the economy until you've reached your utopia where, oh, don't worry, everyone will do their part because everyone cares about each other. We can all make nice.
That would be true if that version of the political spectrum were based on levels of freedom. If so, the far left would be totalitarian and contain communism, fascism, and Nazism, with the furthest right being anarchy. However, that's not what this political spectrum means at all. It's actually the spectrum between radicals and reactionaries, between militant progressives and militant traditionalists. It's an effective diagram for showing this paradigm, but one-dimensional spectrums don't allow for us to get a proper understanding of the true relation of ideologies. For that, the political compass like the one you show in your thumbnail and never mention again is best. On top of using the political compass model, I like the version from the Vote 1 app, which shows the location of many different ideologies. Here we see both the difference between the right and left economically, as well as the paradigm of freedom from anarchism to totalitarianism. It also shows the true location of National Socialism, economically centrist and totalitarian.
Free market system. You can do that if you want. You can set up a living society like that. There's literally nothing stopping you. Under an authoritarian leftist state, you don't have a choice. You cannot opt out of the utopia. If you attempt to do so, you will die. And they spread the myth that conservatives are racist, and since Nazis are racist too, it adds up. Like, okay, so let's just assume for the sake of argument all conservatives are racist. We're all white supremacists. If we are conservatives, if we embrace the principles of limited government, of individual rights, of free market economies, the extent of our racism is that we don't want you to live near us and we don't want you in our stores. Is that bad? Sure, I mean, yeah, it's not really nice, it's not polite, but to compare that to the levels of anti-Semitism that the Nazis displayed as somehow a symptom of the same bigotry is just astoundingly stupid.
In a Western democracy, you have the right to be personally bigoted. Under Nazism, the government kills you. Do you see the difference? In America, everyone is equal under the law. You can get into the arguments, of course, about the systematic racism and oppression. There's no legitimate evidence to support those arguments, but you can get into them. Under Nazism, you don't have rights, you aren't treated as individuals under the law, and you couldn't get into those arguments about whether or not the state is fair, because if you did, they'd punish you, probably by killing you.
The government in totalitarian states enforces uniformity regardless of its place economically. Less authoritarian ideologies usually create more individualism, while more authoritarian ideologies usually create more collectivism. It's just a part of the government enforcing its will upon the populace.
The idea that it's somehow an extreme manifestation of far-right beliefs is just nonsense. If you align it on the political spectrum with where it actually is, it's not on the right, it's on the left. All the government control manifests on the left, and now all of a sudden there's this one section of the right that breaks the linear pattern and just happens to be authoritarian? No! This isn't hidden at all. The Nazis weren't ashamed of this. It's in their platform. If you read the Nazi Party platform, it doesn't sound like what conservatives are advocating for, but it sounds a lot more like what the left is advocating for.
It actually sounds entirely like what the Nazi Party was advocating for. You know, because it's their party platform. But let's actually very quickly go through the 25-point plan as it was called and see exactly where the policies fit. Okay, so here we have the 25-point plan. I'll go through each point and I'll say just broadly where the policies fit in terms of, are they economic, are they nationalist, are they in regards to government control, and just go through it like that. Point 1. We demand the union of all Germans in a great Germany on the basis of the principle of self-determination of all peoples. This is somewhat related to point 3, but essentially it's in regard to territory in other countries where a majority of the population happen to be of German descent. More of a nationalist policy. Point 2. We demand that the German people have rights equal to those of other nations, and that the peace treaties of Versailles and Saint-Germain shall be abrogated. This is all about reversing the punishments given after World War I. This is again a nationalist policy. Point 3. We demand land and territory for the maintenance of our people and the settlement of our surplus population. This policy is a part of Lebensraum, or living space, where the party is demonstrating its desire to take back lost territory as well as gain new territory. It's also a nationalist policy. 4. Only those who are our fellow countrymen can become citizens. Only those who have German blood, regardless of creed, can be our countrymen. Hence, no Jew can be a countryman. The first of racial and religious policy, really a declaration of Jews as second-class citizens, which was particularly normal in those times. It wasn't until after the Holocaust that people started to ease their views about Jews. Point 5. Those who are not citizens must live in Germany as foreigners and must be subject to the law of aliens. Essentially, if you are not a citizen, you will be treated as a foreigner. Again, a nationalist policy. 6. The right to choose the government and determine the laws of the state shall belong only to citizens. We therefore demand that no public office, of whatever nature, whether in the central government, the province, or the municipality, shall be held by anyone who is not a citizen. We wage war against the corrupt parliamentary administration, whereby men are appointed to posts by favor of the party without regard to character and fitness. Non-citizens are not allowed to hold public office, and essentially a statement that bad parliamentary ministers are bad ministers. Mostly an authoritarian policy, as it prevents more people from holding public office, but many countries have similar policies. Point 7. We demand that the state shall above all undertake to ensure that every citizen shall have the possibility of living decently and earning a livelihood. If it should not be possible to feed the whole population, then aliens, or non-citizens, must be expelled from the Reich. This policy could sound like welfare, but it is more intended to mean that work should be available for all, since welfare goes against point 11. This point also says that non-citizens shall be deported if food gets short. The first part is really just anti-unemployment, and the second part is nationalist. Point 8. Any further immigration of non-citizens must be prevented. We demand that all non-Germans who have entered Germany since August 2nd, 1914 shall be compelled to leave the Reich immediately. Again, another nationalist policy. Many of these have to do with the nation more than personal freedom or the economy. Point 9. All citizens must possess equal rights and duties. This is partly collectivist, but also demonstrates rule of law for citizens. 10. The first duty of every citizen must be to work mentally or physically. No individual shall do any work that offends against the interest of the community to the benefit of all. Everyone must work, and it must not be against the benefit of the country. Nationalist and collectivist policy. Therefore, we demand, point 11, that all unearned income and all income that does not arise from work be abolished. This goes against redistribution of wealth and welfare, making it an inherently anti-Marxist policy. It was also meant to keep bankers and the like from making their profit off of interest and different types of loans. This is an economic policy and is definitely centrist when it comes down to it. Point 12. Since every war imposes on the people fearful sacrifices in blood and treasure, all personal profit arising from the war must be regarded as treason to the people. We therefore demand the total confiscation of all war profits. More nationalist than economic, since the stated reason for confiscating war profits is because it is essentially making money from the deaths of soldiers. 13. We demand the nationalization of all trusts. This is mostly related to point 11, since under a trust, the beneficiary makes a profit from the transaction between the trustor and the trustee. Point 14. We demand profit sharing in large industries. Authoritarian policy, since it forces it. Point 15. We demand a generous increase in old age pensions. Pensions are a part of the Nazis' version of socialism, but more of an economic policy, and I would speculate that it doesn't go against point 11 because the elderly would have, in theory, worked their entire lives. Point 16. We demand the creation and maintenance of a sound middle class, the immediate communalization of large stores which will be rented cheaply to small tradespeople, and the strongest consideration must be given to ensure that small traders shall deliver the supplies needed by the state, the provinces, and the municipalities. This policy is meant to stimulate industry by renting property to citizens to run businesses. The fact that they wish to form a middle class, as opposed to abolishing class entirely, goes completely against Marxism. It is definitely an economic policy. Point 17. We demand an agrarian reform in accordance with our national requirements and the enactment of a law to expropriate the owners without compensation of any land needed for the common purpose, the abolition of ground rents, the prohibition of all speculation in land. This policy is meant to make sure that all owned land is serving a purpose other than just making money, another authoritarian policy. 18. We demand that ruthless war be waged against those who work to the injury of the common welfare. Traitors, usurers, profiteers, etc. are to be punished with death regardless of creed or race. Another nationalist policy. Point 19. We demand that Roman law, which serves a materialist ordering of the world, be replaced by German common law. Another nationalist policy. Point 20. In order to make it possible for every capable and industrious German to obtain a higher education, and thus the opportunity to reach into positions of leadership, the state must assume the responsibility of organizing thoroughly the entire cultural system of the people. The curricula of the educational establishments shall be adapted to practical life. The conception of the state idea, science of citizenship, must be taught in the schools from the very beginning. We demand that specially talented children of poor parents, whatever their station or occupation, be educated at the expense of the state. State-funded education, which teaches practical skills as well as indoctrinates the youth into the party platform. It also supports the idea of state-funded scholarships for underprivileged children if they are talented. All economic policy and still part of Nazi socialism. Point 21. The state has the duty to help raise the standard of national health by providing maternity welfare centers, by prohibiting juvenile labor, by increasing physical fitness through the introduction of compulsory games and gymnastics, and by the greatest possible encouragement of associations concerned with the physical education of the young. This is all mostly nationalist policy as it has to do with the health of the populace. Point 22. We demand the abolition of the regular army and the creation of a national folk army. Nationalist policy. Point 23. We demand that there be a legal campaign against those who propagate deliberate political lies and disseminate them through the press. In order to make possible the creation of a German press, we demand a. All editors and their assistants on newspapers published in the German language shall be German citizens. B. Non-German newspapers shall only be published with the express permission of the state. They must not be published in the German language. C. All financial interests in or in any way affecting German newspapers shall be forbidden to non-Germans by law, and we demand that the punishment for transgressing this law be the immediate suppression of the newspaper and the expulsion of the non-Germans from the Reich. Newspapers transgressing against the common welfare shall be suppressed. We demand legal action against those tendencies in art and literature that have a disruptive influence upon the life of our folk, and that any organizations that offend against the foregoing demands shall be dissolved. Authoritarian policy that restricts freedom of the press based on what content is published and the origin of the publication. 24. We demand freedom for all religious faiths in the state insofar as they do not endanger its existence or offend the moral and ethical sense of the Germanic race. The party, as such, represents the point of view of a positive Christianity without binding itself to any one particular confession. It fights against the Jewish material spirit within and without, and is convinced that a lasting recovery of our folk can only come about from within on the principle. And then in big capital letters, common good before individual good. There's the collectivism inherent in totalitarian societies coming into effect in that last phrase, but Nazi Germany was indifferent on religion that wasn't Judaism, as long as it didn't hurt the nation. Point 25. In order to carry out this program, we demand the creation of a strong central authority in the state, the unconditional authority by the political central parliament of the whole state and all its organizations, the formation of professional committees and of committees representing the several estates of the realm to ensure that the laws promulgated by the central authority shall be carried out by the federal states. The leaders of the party undertake to promote the execution of the foregoing points at all costs, if necessary, at the sacrifice of their own lives. That's all authoritarian policy regarding the structure of the government. So, as we can see, the program doesn't necessarily scream left or right wing economically. Most of it is focused on building up the nation, and what economic bits are there are far from Marxist.
Likely because they share the same side of the political spectrum. Are you really accusing the left of being Nazis? Like, the whole point of this is a defense from the accusations that the left throws at the right for being Nazis, except this one is actually rooted in historical fact.
Except it's not at all. Most likely the biggest problem with this argument is that it's essentially the intellectual equivalent of saying no you to any sort of insult. The only way you can be rooted in historical fact is if you acknowledge where Nazism fits on the political spectrum, and that's neither on the left or the right.
This is all publicly available information. They call for the abolition of unearned income, the nationalization of industry, division of profits, welfare expansion, centralized education, and a duty of the individuals to the state, and a duty of the state to provide for the people. The points in the platform that the liberals will cite as evidence that, oh, well, Nazis are right-wing would be things like you have to be a German citizen to live in Germany, and that they wanted to prevent the immigration of non-citizens. The difference here would be that the Nazis only wanted people that were ethnically German to live in Germany, and conservatives just want people to come in legally so we know who they are. Same thing with the other one. Germany wanted to stop the immigration of non-citizens, so do conservatives, but only because conservatives want them to do so legally so that they can actually become citizens. And liberals shared these views on immigration within my lifetime. It seems that they've only begun to oppose them when Trump began to advocate for them.
You have the stereotype of the conservative racist, which in theory makes sense to some degree, because if I'm racist and I believe that my race is superior to other races, I would advocate for a system that allows for natural hierarchies to form so that my race can assert itself as dominant. But if I'm a conservative and I believe in those systems, it's likely because I believe in personal freedom and liberty and not the class warfare and identity politics of the left. I don't see myself as a heterosexual white Christian male. I see myself as a person. So I'm not too concerned with group identity at all. So it's tricky, but
Identity politics are their own thing, and anyone of any ideology could hold their own beliefs when it comes to that. It's just that leftists are in many places ideologically required to deal with identity politics, mostly when it comes to class, due to Marxist teaching.
I mean, you've got studies from Yale that show liberals are more racist than conservatives. You've got studies that show liberals lower the complexity of their speech when they talk to black people. The stereotype of the racist white liberal exists too, and it's arguably more accurate. I mean, yesterday we found out that Democrat delegate in Maryland referred to her district as the N-word district. And it's funny because if it were a Republican, the headlines would have all been, Republican calls black voters N-word, but they didn't want people to know that she was a Democrat. So they just wrote, Maryland delegate, blah, blah. And I'm sure you can find examples of this from people on the right. I don't think that racism is exclusively found in one party. I think a lot of it is generational. Also, I think it isn't just white people. Black people are actually the most racist demographic in America by their own admission. There's a 2013 study from Rasmussen that showed that, and they were actually one of the most accurate pollsters in 2016 as well, when everyone, oh, we just got the numbers wrong. We just didn't expect this. Were they lying? Or were they just wrong? I don't know.
But anyways, the reality is that fascism and Nazism, both in theory and in practice, do not align with the right. They aren't right-wing ideologies. They certainly aren't far-right. If anything, they're leftist ideologies. The whole idea of the political spectrum, it's very complex, and it's hard to distinguish and compare ideologies based on economic freedom and personal freedom, but authoritarian leftism is Nazism. Authoritarian leftism is communism. And within the context of American politics, which is the context that this discussion is taking place in, because we're being told that the modern right is an extreme and a form of Nazism or fascism, you cannot be both on the right and a Nazi or a fascist, because the very beliefs that would categorize you as right-wing go against the beliefs of Nazism and fascism.
Nazism is not leftist, but communism certainly is. You're right that it can be hard to compare ideologies, but the political compass that I showed earlier is possibly as close as one can get to the true positions of each ideology, and though there are probably many subcategories inside each of them, it does a good job of painting broadly where each ideology fits in best. Although Nazism goes against being right-wing, fascism doesn't so much. It goes against personal liberty, but it doesn't support some of the same programs as National Socialism, which makes it more right-leaning while staying totalitarian. The biggest point you have going against you is that you keep going back to the one-dimensional political spectrum as though it is a spectrum of freedom, and it's a big problem when your argument is based on an already bad graph you are incorrectly referencing.
You might be right-wing in the sense that you believe in free markets and individual liberties, but holding those beliefs and then also being a racist does not make you a Nazi. It just makes you a racist. In order to be a Nazi, you have to surrender your liberty to the state. Even the neo-Nazis are primarily characterized by their racism and their anti-Semitism.
I don't mean to split hairs over this, but I feel that it should be pointed out that neo-Nazis aren't National Socialists. They're just racists that LARP as Nazis. Look at the Aryan Brotherhood, then imagine what would happen if one of those drug-dealing criminals were caught by the SS in Nazi Germany. I can assure you it would not end well for them.
Dig a little bit deeper, turns out they also want to do away with democracy, which ties back to the traditional Nazi disdain for Western democracy, which, if you're a conservative or a classical liberal, that's going to be a big problem for you. You cannot be both far right and a Nazi, because the beliefs that you hold that would classify you as a right-winger directly contradict the beliefs that would classify you as a Nazi. There are examples of right-wing authoritarianism. George W. Bush, solid example. Oh, W was a great man. You don't have to defend him to me. He's probably got friends working in the DHS or NSA that are listening to this right now. He'll be fine, but the point is that capitalism doesn't guarantee freedom, but everywhere that there is freedom, there is capitalism. The Nazis did not uphold any form of freedom, be it personal or economic, to use the traditional political spectrum as a metric. Nazism and fascism are substantially closer to communism than they are to any sort of right-wing ideology. And all three of them are authoritarian leftist ideologies that have killed tens of millions of people.
All three are totalitarian, yes, but one is far left, one is centrist, and one is right-leaning. I don't think I need to explain anymore how National Socialism is centrist, but I do feel the need to end this with some final thoughts. I certainly don't think that John and other conservatives who attempt to argue this same point are stupid. There are many things I agree with them on, and that which I can't agree with them on I can at least understand. This, however, I have found to be the most criminally misunderstood that many of them parrot. I feel as though it's a knee-jerk defense against the left who use it as an insult ad nauseum. Of course, if your neighbor turned out to be a serial killer, you may not want to acknowledge that, but I feel that it's just so factually incorrect to say that Nazism is left or right that the record needs to be put straight. It's centrist. It's totalitarian. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging that, but denying it is factually dishonest and incorrect.